On September 26, 1983, in a bunker buried beneath the forests south of Moscow, a single decision prevented the extinction of humanity. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat before a wall of screens in the command center of the Soviet Union's early warning system, Serpukhov 15. His duty was simple: watch for American missile launches and report them immediately to the General Staff. The protocol was clear: if the satellites detected incoming warheads, he would sound the alarm. Soviet leadership would have minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike before their own missiles were destroyed on the ground. That night, at just past midnight, the system screamed a warning. 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles were heading toward the Soviet Union. The screens flashed red. Alarms howled through the bunker. Every instinct, every regulation, every drill told Petrov to pick up the phone and report an attack. His hand hovered over the receiver, but something felt wrong. The satellites reported only 5 missiles. If the Americans were launching a first strike, why would they send just 5? It made no strategic sense. A real attack would involve hundreds. Petrov's mind raced through possibilities while his staff waited for orders. He had seconds to decide: report the attack and risk triggering a nuclear war based on faulty data, or trust his instinct and violate protocol. He chose logic over orders. He declared it a false alarm. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. No explosions, no impacts, no war. The system had malfunctioned. Sunlight reflecting off clouds had been mistaken for missile launches. Petrov's refusal to follow procedure had saved the world. But the Soviet military did not thank him. They reprimanded him for incomplete paperwork and for undermining the system. His story remained classified for decades. To the world, September 26, 1983 was just another day. Only a handful of people knew how close civilization had come to annihilation, and that one quiet officer had stood between panic and reason. Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov was born in 1939 in a small village near Vladivostok, in the far eastern reaches of the Soviet Union. His father was a fighter pilot in World War II, a decorated veteran who had defended Leningrad during the siege. His mother worked in a munitions factory. From childhood, Petrov was surrounded by the machinery and discipline of Soviet military life. But unlike many of his peers who romanticized glory in combat, he was drawn to systems, logic, and problem-solving. He studied engineering at the Kiev Higher Engineering Radiotechnical College of the Soviet Air Force, specializing in computer systems and radar technology. By the early 1960s, as the Cold War deepened, Petrov found himself working on the new generation of early warning systems designed to detect missile launches from across the globe. These were not simple radar stations. They were vast networks of satellites, ground stations, and computer processors designed to give Soviet commanders enough warning to launch their own missiles before American warheads destroyed them. The logic was brutal and binary: detect, report, retaliate. There was no room for doubt, no time for second-guessing. Petrov was promoted rapidly, not because he sought advancement, but because he understood the systems better than anyone else. He did not see his work as preparing for war. He saw it as preventing one. His colleagues described him as calm, thoughtful, and unusually skeptical of absolute certainty. In a culture where obedience was paramount, Petrov quietly believed that blind adherence to procedure could be just as dangerous as insubordination. By the early 1980s, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached a fever pitch. President Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire and launched a massive military buildup. The Soviets, struggling economically, responded with their own escalation. Both sides deployed thousands of nuclear warheads on hair-trigger alert. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction meant that neither side could afford to hesitate. A single mistake, a misread signal, or a faulty sensor could trigger the end of civilization. In this atmosphere of paranoia and precision, Petrov was assigned to the command center at Serpukhov 15, the nerve center of the Soviet satellite early warning system known as OKO, or I. The system used infrared sensors on satellites to detect the heat signatures of rocket launches. When a launch was detected, the information was relayed instantly to the command bunker, where duty officers like Petrov would assess the threat and report it up the chain of command. The system was designed to eliminate human error. But it introduced a new problem. It assumed the technology was infallible. Petrov knew better. He had seen glitches, false positives, and sensor malfunctions during training exercises. He understood that the satellites were watching for heat blooms that could be caused by many things: forest fires, industrial explosions, even unusual weather patterns. The system was sophisticated, but it was not perfect. That knowledge, quietly held, would prove decisive. On the night of September 26, 1983, Petrov was the duty officer on the overnight shift. The bunker was quiet, staffed by a skeleton crew. Outside, the world slept, unaware of the invisible calculations being performed in the skies above. Just after midnight, the alarm sounded. The main screen flashed red with the word launch. A single American missile had been detected. Petrov's heart pounded, but his training took over. He checked the system status. The satellite was functioning normally. The trajectory matched an intercontinental ballistic missile launch from a known American base. Within seconds, the system updated. 2 more missiles, then 3, then 5. The alarms grew louder. His staff looked at him, waiting for the order. Protocol was clear. He was required to immediately notify the general staff that an attack was underway. Once notified, Soviet leadership would have approximately 20 minutes to decide whether to launch their own missiles in retaliation. If they waited too long, the incoming warheads would destroy Soviet missile silos, leaving the country defenseless. The pressure to act was absolute. Petrov stared at the screen. 5 missiles, not 10, not 100, just 5. It didn't make sense. If the Americans were launching a first strike, they would launch everything at once to overwhelm Soviet defenses. 5 missiles was not enough to cripple the Soviet arsenal. It was barely enough to justify the risk of starting a global nuclear war. But the system insisted the launches were real. His staff urged him to report. The seconds stretched into eternity. He made his decision. He picked up the phone and told the general staff that the system had malfunctioned. It was a false alarm. He had no proof. He was acting on instinct, experience, and logic. He was violating every rule in the manual. If he was wrong and American missiles were truly inbound, he would be responsible for the destruction of his country. But if he was right and he triggered a retaliatory strike based on bad data, he would be responsible for ending human civilization. He chose reason over fear. The minutes that followed were the longest of Petrov's life. He waited for the impacts that never came. His staff watched the clock, counting down the time it would take for missiles to reach Soviet territory. 10 minutes, 15, 20, nothing. No detonations, no fireballs, no war. The system had been wrong. Later analysis revealed that the satellites had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for the infrared signature of missile launches. It was a rare alignment of atmospheric conditions and sensor angles, a false positive that the system's designers had never anticipated. Petrov's refusal to blindly trust the technology had prevented a catastrophe, but his superiors did not see it that way. Instead of being celebrated, he was quietly reprimanded. His official report had been incomplete. He had not followed protocol. He had undermined confidence in the early warning system. The Soviet military could not afford to admit that their billion-ruble satellite network had nearly started a nuclear war by mistake. So they blamed the officer who had prevented it. Petrov was reassigned to a less sensitive post. His career stalled. He never received a medal, never saw his name in the newspapers, never heard a word of thanks from the commanders whose lives he had saved. The incident was classified. For years, even his family did not know what had happened that night. To the world, he was just another Soviet officer, unremarkable and forgotten. Petrov retired from the military in 1984. Less than a year after the incident, he left the service quietly, without fanfare, and took a job as an engineer in a research institute. He lived modestly in a small apartment in the Moscow suburbs, far from the corridors of power and the bunkers where decisions of life and death were made. For more than a decade, his story remained buried in classified files. The world continued to spin, oblivious to how close it had come to annihilation. But in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, documents began to emerge. Journalists and historians sifting through newly declassified archives stumbled upon references to the September 1983 incident. They found Petrov's name in the reports, along with fragments of testimony from his staff. Slowly, the truth came to light. In 1998, a Russian newspaper published the first account of what had happened. The story spread quickly. Western journalists tracked Petrov down to his modest apartment and asked him to explain. He spoke carefully, without drama or self-aggrandizement. He described the incident as a matter of logic. The system had reported an attack that made no strategic sense. He had trusted his judgment over the machine. When asked if he considered himself a hero, he shrugged. "I was just doing my job," he said. "I had a funny feeling in my gut." But the world did not see it that way. To them, Petrov was the man who had single-handedly prevented World War III. He had faced the most consequential decision any human being could face, and he had chosen reason over reflex, thought over terror. Recognition came slowly, but it came. In 2004, the Association of World Citizens awarded him the World Citizen Award in San Francisco. It was the first time he had traveled outside Russia. He stood on stage, visibly uncomfortable with the applause, and quietly thanked the audience for remembering. In 2006, he was honored at the United Nations in New York. Dignitaries and scientists praised him as a savior of humanity. He remained humble, insisting that he had simply done what made sense. "I did not want to start a war," he said. "That is all." As the years passed, Petrov's story became a symbol of the fragility of peace and the dangers of automated systems. Experts in nuclear strategy and computer science pointed to the 1983 incident as proof that technology, no matter how sophisticated, could fail catastrophically. They argued that placing the fate of civilization in the hands of machines and rigid protocols was a recipe for disaster. Petrov's decision to override the system had not been reckless. It had been wise, yet even as his fame grew, Petrov lived in near poverty. His Soviet military pension was small, and the Russian government offered him no additional support. He survived on the generosity of admirers and the occasional speaking engagement. Friends and journalists who visited him in his later years described a man who seemed worn down by time and obscurity, yet still possessed the same quiet clarity that had saved the world. He never expressed bitterness about his treatment by the Soviet military. When asked why he had not been rewarded, he simply said that the system did not like to admit its mistakes. In interviews, Petrov reflected on the nature of the Cold War and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. He called it madness. "All it takes is one mistake," he said, "and everything is gone." He believed that nuclear weapons had created a world where logic and restraint were the only defenses against annihilation. The irony, he noted, was that the very systems designed to protect nations from surprise attacks could themselves trigger the wars they were meant to prevent. His story became a case study in military academies, ethics courses, and computer science programs. It raised uncomfortable questions. How much should we trust automated systems? What happens when protocol conflicts with reason? Who should have the authority to make life and death decisions in the age of machines? Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017, at the age of 77. His death went unnoticed for months. It was only in September, when a German friend tried to contact him, that the world learned he was gone. Obituaries appeared in newspapers across the globe. The New York Times called him the man who saved the world. The BBC described him as the Soviet officer who averted nuclear war. His funeral was small, attended by a handful of relatives and friends. There were no state honors, no military salute, no monument erected in his name. He was buried quietly in a cemetery outside Moscow, his grave marked by a simple stone. But his legacy lived on. In the years since his death, Petrov's story has been told and retold in books, documentaries, and films. It has become a parable about the limits of technology and the enduring importance of human judgment. It reminds us that systems, no matter how advanced, are only as good as the people who operate them. And it shows that sometimes the most heroic act is not to follow orders, but to question them. The September 1983 incident also sparked renewed debate about nuclear weapons and the risks of automated early warning systems. Experts pointed out that the same vulnerabilities that nearly caused disaster in 1983 still exist today. Satellites can still malfunction, computers can still generate false positives, and the time allowed for decision-making has only grown shorter. In an age of hypersonic missiles and cyber warfare, the margin for error has shrunk to minutes, even seconds. Petrov's decision stands as a warning. The next time, we may not be so lucky. In the end, Stanislav Petrov was not a general, not a politician, not a scientist who invented a new technology. He was an engineer, a middle-ranking officer who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right temperament. He did not seek glory. He did not expect recognition. He simply applied logic to a situation where logic was desperately needed. His weapon was not a missile or a bomb, but a moment of clarity in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. He understood that the greatest threat to humanity was not malice, but the rigid adherence to flawed systems. He proved that sometimes disobedience is the highest form of duty. Today, his name is not widely known. There are no statues of him in Red Square, no monuments in Washington, but every day that passes without nuclear war is a testament to his choice. Every child born, every city that stands, every dream pursued exists because one man, in a bunker beneath the Russian forest, chose to trust reason over fear. Petrov's legacy is not written in stone or bronze. It is written in the continued existence of the world itself. He did not invent a machine or discover a scientific principle. He did something far more profound. He reminded us that technology, no matter how advanced, is only a tool. The future depends not on the systems we build, but on the wisdom with which we use them. In a war defined by machines and automation, Petrov proved that the power of human thought, the ability to question, to doubt, to reason, could be the most decisive weapon of all. The accountant who cracked a Nazi code, the engineer who made steam efficient, the inventor who humiliated the Admiralty, all changed the world by refusing to accept the limits of convention. Stanislav Petrov changed the world by refusing to obey a system that was about to destroy it. His story is a quiet echo of a simple truth: that progress depends not on following orders, but on knowing when to break them.